Today we're going to talk about the history of conservation biology in terms of the movements and the ideas that led to the entity that we have now. And while you don't always have to go in the history of all your subjects, I think our history is particularly important and particularly relevant for the activities that we do today and going forward. So we're going to talk about a lot of stuff. There'll be a lot of, especially later on in the lecture, there'll be a lot of dates and things. So the Mountain Lion lecture is up on YouTube and on iTunes, and this will be the same way as of today. So if you guys want to go review stuff or grab info, that's the easiest way. So we're going to talk about a couple different segments here and take a break or two along the way. First, I want to talk about the general, sort of in broad strokes, potential influence of humanity on ecosystems, to some of the very philosophical underpinnings of the general conservation movement, and then go into the specific history of what happened here in our country, since the modern conservation movement was really birthed here in the U.S. And then we'll end with a question, which is, so we're going to spend a bunch of time today going over all these things. You guys are learning all kinds of interesting things this semester in this class and elsewhere. So the last question is simply knowledge of what's been going on, knowledge of potential environmental degradation, is that enough to promote effective conservation? And so we'll look at a test case at the very end of the lecture. Cool? All right, let's get going. So the first step here, first part, is nothing potentially new, potentially a very old idea, which is that our human population is in some way, shape, or form related to environmental quality. You know, on the most extreme sense, you could say if everything was a molten lava field, nobody could live there, right? So there's some type of general relationship. What that relationship is, maybe we're not sure of, but there's some gross correlation there and or causation. And then secondly, it's possible that humans could degrade our environment to the extent that we would in turn suffer greatly. Old ideas. These are just a couple small examples here. One, it might be a little small for you guys in the back, but this one on the left here, this is birds in the UK from back in the day, 1970 to middle part of last decade. And the different colors just represent different categories of birds. So for example, the light blue is coastal species, the yellow is farmland, etc. And this is all relative, this is all standardized to 1970. So if you guys can't see the exact label in the very far back, the dotted line here is 100, so everything is pegged to that. So it's all relative to the numbers of birds that we had in 1970. And then we're going forward from 1970 to modern times, and what you see is things change, things waver. It's a natural system, so there's never a perfect up and down. It's not like physics or chemistry or anything like that. So we see a lot of things are sort of roughly similar. Some things are going up. So we have our coastal species, from this glance, appear to be doing fairly well. Farmland species are totally tanking, right? This dark blue are woodland species. Those birds aren't doing so well either. So things are changing. It turns out what appears to be going on here is a combination of continuing development and fragmentation, but also climate change. So a lot of these responses we're seeing are due to climate change. In the case of the farmland critters, there's nowhere for these birds to be displaced to. As things warm up, there's nowhere they can jump north of the UK, really. In the case of the coastal species, what we're seeing is a lot of the European species are leaving, say, Spain and France and that sort of area and migrating up. So something appears to be going on, maybe not. And then over here on the right, we could talk about, for example, fresh water availability. So in this case, this is fresh water in different countries. On the far left over here is Bangladesh, then the US, Mexico, Kenya, and Jordan. And the gray bar is the amount of fresh water per person that was readily available in 1950. The light green bar is 1995, and the brown is forecasted for 2050. And this was an old forecast. This is unfortunately probably overly optimistic. But what you see is we're sucking up more and more water. We're sucking up more and more water all across the planet. But certain areas are having an even tougher go than our others. And this is primarily driven by, the availability is primarily driven by people's our consumption of that water, right? Our existing and past demands on that water. So these are old ideas that this possibly could be going on. But many people seem hell-bent on saying it's not true. So there's no shortage of examples to show you guys. This is a famous piece by an individual who is very biased, I would suggest, and doesn't really believe in what you might call facts or what you might call reality. This is a gentleman who talked in this piece, this op-ed piece from the Wall Street, or this is the Washington Post, saying that global warming is just more weirdness left over from previous theories. And in this case, he's comparing it to nuclear winter, which is this idea that spun up in the 70s and 80s about if we were to have a nuclear holocaust. You guys are too young, but when I was growing up, it was it seemed very likely that the world would end in a nuclear insane asylum, right? And so one of the things folks took to arguing that might be a bad thing, not just in the outright destruction, but was starting to look at what would be the immediate aftermath, and it was this notion of nuclear winter, which was there'd be so much soot in the air and soil and particles in the air it would actually create a situation akin to when the asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula and darkened the sun for years on end and all kinds of stuff. And many people said that was, even though it was based on atmospheric modeling and data, it was an alarmist thing. So some people don't believe that things like global warming are actually happening, even though we have things like data that show that we are reaching insane levels of greenhouse gases. And you have dialogues such as this. We've all seen this.
CO2 is not a pollutant. CO2 is a naturally occurring gas, and thank God we have it. If we didn't have CO2, the planet would be uninhabitable. Plants wouldn't live. What we're doing is we are adding CO2 to the atmosphere, and if it were a closed system, like a greenhouse, then yeah, you would expect temperatures to rise exponentially. But the Earth's atmosphere is not a closed system. There are a lot of different factors that go into it, and the models that are predicting catastrophic temperature rise, they don't get the past temperature correct.
Not true.
They don't reflect present temperatures accurately.
Not true.
But we're told to trust them in their predictions 100 years from now.
Okay, hold on, guys. No question.
I think whether we agree or disagree, it's good that we bring attention to this subject, because the youth in America are going to be the ones who are going to have to deal with this and make the changes. So if we get them involved now through this movie or other media, that's a good thing.
Shirley, would you agree with that?
Everybody in our audience is shaking their heads. Yes, I totally agree with you. It's just presenting facts rather than as people like.
But that's the problem. If I thought Al Gore's movie was, as you like to say, fair and balanced, I'd say everyone should go and see it. But why go see propaganda? You don't go see Joseph Goebbels' films to see the truth about Nazi Germany. You don't want to go see Al Gore's film to see the truth about global warming.
Sterling's an odd one to be casting aspersions on what Al Gore's motives are. After all, the oil industry's been giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to his organization, just like tobacco companies used to do to try to undercut the actual.
Oh, okay, can't talk about that. Let's go on to something else. So of course, anytime somebody brings up Nazis, there should be a red flag, and most of those folks don't know what the hell they're talking about. So that's the first thing. But really talking about what might be a problem forecast in the future is somehow World War II propaganda? Really? I don't think so, right? But yet folks like that are given airtime, right? And people that Gesundheit have no training. One more example. This is another well-known essay that was from, this one is from the Wall Street Journal. And in this case, what it was saying was people concerned about conservation, people concerned about their environmental impact, for example, are actually anti-societal. That to even think about your pollution impact or whatever is not helpful. And so the example here was saying that, hey, you should all be driving the largest SUV you possibly could be, right? And because were you to be in a smaller compact vehicle, let's say, a more fuel efficient or electric or hybrid or something of that nature, you're endangering your children. And therefore, that's immoral to do that. So apparently we should all be driving around in semis, and that's some type of good society. I mean, totally through the looking glass type thinking, right? Bizarre, insane, illogical thinking. But nevertheless, in certain centers of power, this is a popular thing to talk about. Okay, there we go. Let's get into our first example. Here's our first example that I'm going to propose to you as examples of absolute confirmation that we can indeed mess with the life support system of our local area. This first example is Easter Island. In Polynesian, the term for the island is Rapa Nui. This is a little teeny spot, and I've put a little map up there with a little red dot, little teeny spot in the middle of the Pacific, really, really far, really isolated, small island. And Rapa Nui is the local name for the island. Most people know it as Easter Island because it was discovered near Easter by the first European explorer to see it. And of course, we always name everything after the Europeans as opposed to the natives. So here is the journal and an excerpt from the journal entry of the Dutch explorer that first saw this place. So he's talking about the first time he saw the island. He said, "We originally, from a further distance, have considered the said Easter Island as sandy." That's key. The reason for that is this, that we counted as sand the withered grass, hay, or other scorched and burnt vegetation. Sounds awesome, right? Totally like Hawaii or something. Because its wasted appearance could give no other impression than of singular poverty and barrenness. So they thought this was a little desert, escarpment or little blurb there. Of course, why we all know Easter Island, how it's entered into the popular lexicon and all this good stuff, are these crazy statues known as moai. And so these are really, really cool. These are, big giant heads. And this is, if you go to a tiki bar or something, these would probably be the classic heads you see, etched on the poles or what have you. And these are really, really iconic. And they've remained iconic ever since outside eyes first encountered this interesting landscape. And they provided the nugget of this mystery that many people are still fascinated with to this day. So here's the mystery. The mystery is when the Europeans landed in 1722, they found about 900 of these big statues, these big heads that are huge. They vary in size, but most are on the order of 10 to 20 meters tall and weigh tens, if not hundreds and hundreds of tons. Really, really an engineering feat to have created these somehow. Half of the ones they found were not complete when the Dutch arrived there for the first time. And almost all of them were knocked down, had fallen down, had degraded. It was like like an old Greek temple you found or something Indiana Jones would go and check out, right? So since then, some have been righted by the tourism ministries and local folks, but a lot were decrepit. At the time, the population was estimated at less than 2,000 people, emaciated and in civil disorder. Now, we have to always read these European settlers' journals with a huge amount of skepticism, right? Were they really that emaciated, whatever? But it seems pretty clear from multiple sources that Whether it was exactly 2,000, that's an optimistic number. It might have been a lot less. Were they really emaciated? It seems they weren't crazy fat. We'll say that, right? So they weren't living high on the hog. And there seems to be a lot of indication that there was some civil disorder. So in other words, this wasn't a perfect, idyllic, wasn't Fiji or any of these other places some of these Pacific explorers were used to encountering. One of the best data points to support that is, okay, so this is not modern, decks and piers and things. So what happened was these big explorer ships would come on in, boop, park, drop anchor, and then they would get out in these little boats and they would row to shore, right? So typically when they would go to, the Cooks or Hawaii or whatever, they would go up, and then the local villagers, the warriors or whoever, would come out in their canoes and check them out. They're big war canoes, right? Lots of people come out. In this case, it's a little bit unclear. Either 3 or 4 canoes came out that were almost underwater, that were leaking badly, could barely stay afloat. Unlike any of the other islands these folks had encountered. As we said, from the initial observation, they thought it was a sandy island. It wasn't. It was grass dominated. So all the vegetation is either grass or grassland type stuff. And they found very few, a very reduced number and diversity of animals that you would typically encounter on a tropical island. So for example, there were no native animals bigger than insects. They were mostly introduced stuff. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And the biggest, absolute biggest animal that they found on land were chickens and rats. Recall this is 1722. Okay? Clearly, why? There was aliens, obviously. Clearly aliens. So how could these people that could barely put a canoe together, articulate these great, hundreds of ton statues that were giant and all this and that? Clearly, and this has been fodder for all kinds of Discovery Channel and History Channel specials, and like this idiot it goes around like, I'm finding there's a link between the Egyptian pyramids and Easter Island, right? And all that kind of jazz. This is one of my favorite books when I was a kid. This was Choose Your Own Adventure. Anybody read Choose Your Own Adventure when you were a kid? No? Oh, only 3 people admit to reading Choose Your Own. Great. Anyway, this is sort of like hypertext before there was hypertext kind of thing. In any event, this is one of my favorite books, and it was, these guys go to Easter Island. They basically find there's UFOs and there's aliens and that whole kind of shtick. So because it's just simply no one could jive these incredibly complicated structures with the fact that these guys couldn't even put a canoe together. So let's talk about the early. Let's talk about what we know. So these are the early inhabitants. As with the rest of Polynesia, these folks are probably the world's the best mariners we've ever had in terms of being able to navigate to different parts of the world. These are little teeny tiny islands, and these guys are navigating across the Pacific and finding them. I mean, incredible skills. No GPS. Easter Island is settled probably around 600 AD, but definitely between 400 and 700 AD. And when the first humans got to this island, it was a different place. It was dominated by subtropical forests, and that forest provided the fodder for this society to get everything from fuel to rope, to make their canoes, to build homes, and all that kind of good stuff. The Easter Island palm was the dominant tree species. So it was a palm forest. And they appeared to have a pretty complex religion, pretty complex social network, and all that good stuff. By 1500 AD, the population was less than, it was more than what we've had later. So again, numbers are hard, but somewhere between 5,000 and 20,000 folks appeared to be, which was at roughly, we think, the peak of the population on Easter Island. So recall, how many people, what was the estimate when the Europeans arrived a couple hundred years later? 2,000, yeah, 2,000 at most. 2,000 at most, right? So this is significantly larger than that. If we look more in depth at these really cool these giant statues, these moais, we see that they're very complex. So let's look at this guy on the right. It's not, many of them are not just a piece of rock. They're actually a complex, a piece of artwork that has stuff from all over the place. So here's, I've put a map of Easter Island showing where all these parts are. So here's a picture on the left. This is a picture from the late 1800s. And you see some explorers looking at one of the quarries. So you see one of these partially cut out, etched heads. And that comes, the quarry, so the rock that makes the bulk of the statue is coming from the middle of the island. And then we can start looking at all these other things. So here's this guy right here. He has a different rock that's making his hat. His eyes are coming from yet another place. The tools used to do the etching are coming from another deposit. So in other words, what we're getting at is to have these things put in place really required a lot of cooperation. If these folks were warring, if they hated each other, if no one talked to one another, there's no way you could have this complex integration of resources from all around the islands and different sources. So this points to something different than what we found when the Europeans arrived. Cool? Are you with me? All right. So I just said that things were really different. How do we know that they're really different? So how much you guys go about figuring out what the historic condition was or what things were like back in the day? What are some lines of evidence you guys might use?
Fossil records.
Okay, so fossils, good, excellent. And so maybe if we didn't have this bird, we didn't have any birds on this island now, but we dug in the ground and we found some old fossils and we could carbon date them or something. And we found, there's at least, 5 different types of beaks or something in the ground, right? So that's one way. What else?
Like pond core samples.
Okay, excellent. So we can look at the so plants don't necessarily fossilize well unless they happen to fall in, let's say, a mud flat or something like some structure was sort of baked into the clay or something like that. But pollen is a very popular thing, right? So most flowering plants put out and other things too, pines and stuff as well, put out pollen, and we can accumulate that pollen and actually look at it. And if it gets layered down at the bottom of a wetland, we can section that core and actually get at what's in there. Good. What else? So we have pollen. We have bone fossils, pollen fossils. Anything else?
Ask the natives. They have any,
Ooh, excellent. Right. So we could just totally right. So that's the best one to just ask folks. Right. What's up? Right. Not a lot of very well preserved historical records. Polynesians didn't do a lot of writing just from the get-go, but then in this place particularly there weren't. But yeah. So stories, but not a lot of yeah. And remember, this is when they found these guys, they were kind of messed up. They weren't really super. They didn't have a library kind of thing, right? Other ideas?
Maybe.
You go. Okay, so archaeological excavation of the people's buildings or where they lived or something, right? John, were you going to say something?
I was going to say something similar, so like an analysis of like their artwork as it progressed.
Okay.
Over time.
Cool.
Archaeological analysis.
Totally. One of the best ways, so some of my friends have published papers on how many birds used to be in Hawaii, and their main source of information were the cloaks, were the tribal cloaks that the chiefs used to wear. You can go in and treat that artwork as essentially a historical record because you knew when it was created. And so, yeah, so totally. Good. Other ideas? All right, cool. So let's look at the lines of evidence that we do have. Good. Those are all good. Okay, so the first is sediment cores. You guys were talking about this. And so sediment cores, how sediment cores typically work, this is a classic picture of this old dude doing this in Arizona State University. And this is just classic professor dude. Old dude with a beard sitting in some sort of chalkboard-filled room and looking at a microscope. And that was the typical way we did it. So if we do that, if we go look at the sediment cores, what we find, what I'm talking about here is just straight up sediment. I'm not talking about seeds or anything yet. Just straight up tube in the ground. We find thick layers of palm pollen, which we have now figured out is Easter Island palm, before 700 AD. Once we get to a bit past then, we lose that signal. And also, once we get past deposits more recent than 1200 AD, we see huge amounts of charcoal, huge amounts of burnt wood. So that's kind of weird. So we go from having a lot of pollen, which implies there's a lot of, in this case, Easter Island palm trees around making pollen, healthy enough to be alive, healthy enough to be making reproductive propagules. And then all of a sudden something happens, and now we have a bunch of burnt, Terminator, end of the world kind of stuff. Okay, so that's from the sediment itself. Next, we could talk about palynology, and so this is what Kevin was talking about. And so this is not from Easter Island. This is my own cartoon. But so this pond is a pond up in the Sierras, and what you can see is, in this case, this is all these pine trees, but they've released their pollen, and so this looks sort of yellowish, a little bit overexposed. That's because these guys have dropped all of their pollen, and the pollen has accumulated on the surface of the water, and any of this genetic input to the next generation is screwed, right? Because they didn't land on an egg or what have you, and so they're going to sit here on the water. They're going to get waterlogged, and then they're either going to sink or something else is going to land on them, and it's going to push them down, and they're going to get deposited on the bottom of that pond. And then there's going to be some rain events. They're going to bring some dirt in, etc. We're going to start layering it. So at some point in the future, people can come in with a tube, jam that, or straw, if you will, jam that straw straight into the mud, pull it up, and you have a core, slice it open, and we get stuff like this. So these are different stained pollen grains. And so some pollen are species specific. So some things are genus specific, some are species specific. So for example, this little guy here with a circle with a dot, that's a piece of grass pollen. Can't tell which grass species, but I can tell it's in the Poaceae family. This guy, you know what this one is? This sort of Mickey Mouse looking thing? Oak tree. All kinds of stuff. How about this spiky one? Anybody have allergies? This is ragweed. So anyway, so some of this stuff, right, that old dude in ASU could be looking through a microscope and actually get at least family level, if not genus or species level stuff. No DNA, no high-tech stuff, just by the shape of the grain. So you do that, you go through it, and we start to add, we take a slice, a thin slice, say the deepest layer, and we can use some carbon-14 to date that layer and say, okay, so this is what we had in this slice, and then take another slice, another slice, another slice, and you generate these types of things. And in this case, what we have is we have a temporal record going from the top of the graph is the most recent, and then back through time is older and older and older. And you see that what we can see is, depending on the site and the location, you can see different species coming up. So maybe there's a fire that burns through the valley. So first we have a lot of oak trees, then a fire comes through, then we have a lot of grass, then we have a lot of shrubs that starts to recover, and then the trees come back, that kind of story. So palynology is the subdiscipline we're talking about here. And so that's how we know that there is that there was this Easter Island palm and all that kind of good stuff. The next thing is you guys talked about is archaeological stuff. And in this case, middens. So middens are garbage heaps. So if we go to the place where Easter Island natives, Rapa Nuians, were dumping their stuff, this is what we find. We find that dolphin, especially common dolphin, was pretty common, say around 1000 AD. Something on the order of about 1/3 of the bones were dolphin bones. So these guys love to eat flipper, right? Good. Next, fish that are wide-ranging, pelagic fish, things like tuna, that kind of stuff, wahoo. Those guys were really also very, very common in the midden piles, say around 1000 AD. After about 1500 AD, no more dolphins and no more pelagic fish ever. After that point, for example, the only fish bones are fish that are really close in next to the reef, really tight into shore. So clearly something happened. And these guys radically shifted their diet. Next line of evidence that things were different back in the day comes from actual biological remnants of stuff. And so we found this in caves. If you find some cracks in the rock, go way back in, we can find are these palm nuts, the actual seed casings of things like Easter Island palm, and they're all chewed up primarily by rats. So rats have a pretty specific dentition, and we can look at how they're scratched up and chewed up. And so we have essentially cast off middens, if you will, of rodents. And then we can look at the actual fossils, as you guys also said. So what we can find on the island are non-pelagic bird bones. So these are birds that don't fly. These are birds like a kiwi type thing, right? That it's a bird that lives on the island, is not dispersing. And so those guys were there. There's none of those guys left now. We also had Kevin or whoever said it, or Riley, whoever said it, we can also find in some very rare conditions where we have sort of mud and the mud's preserved, we can see palm frond impressions. So we actually see the photosynthetic structure of these trees. So we see that we know there were Easter Island palms there from the pollen. We know there's Easter Island palms there from eaten husks of their seeds. And we know they were there from seeing the impressions in formerly wet areas or wetland areas. Cool? Everybody with me? So, of course, we don't have any real pictures of what it looked like back then, but this is what it seems to have looked like. So this is from other islands, but something like this, a palm forest. So typical sort of South Pacific-y kind of thing, lots of tall vegetation, a closed canopy, palms dominate. So this is what we think they quote-unquote should have seen. If we just looked at the environmental conditions of the area and the rainfall and this and that, this is what we would have thought, and this is what they actually saw. This is what we saw after humans had been there for many hundreds of years when the Dutch folks first made it to shore. Cool? Then this is why, from a distance, it looked sandy. It looked smooth because they were used to seeing trees and dark green canopies. So this is what seems to have happened. This seems to be a classic case, maybe the classic case, of overpopulation. The Easter Island palm does not exist anymore. It is an extinct species. It went extinct, we think, around 1400 AD. The Totomiro tree went extinct on the island locally by 1960. 5 samples had been taken to Kew Botanical Gardens in the UK, and there's now a reintroduction program. But had we not done that, this other important tree, one of the other woody species on the island, would have been gone in our lifetime, in the recent decades. What seems to have been going on is this positive feedback loop of degradation, of environmental degradation. So our human society got to the level where there was so many of us, we started to have problems. In addition to our numbers, we're also, as with almost every single one of the cases and challenges we'll be faced with this semester and onwards, it's never one thing. It's almost never one thing. It's a network of stressors. And so in this case, not only were there more and more people needing more and more energy and material flows to keep them around, but also we unintentionally introduced rats when the Polynesians came over. Okay? And so rats came in and they started eating the seeds, right? So more rats equals more seed predation equals less reproductive output from the trees. Similarly, these rats started attacking the forest birds, and those forest birds were assisters of the dispersal of these seeds. So not only did more rats equal more seed predation, they also reduce the birds, and the birds also in turn reduce the dispersal and the pollination of the trees. So it's this, so everything is making everything worse. And then once the trees start to get relatively thinned out or relatively rare in areas, these soils, these tropical soils, are very erodible. They really need to have a pretty thick vegetation on top of them. It's not meters and meters and meters and meters thick soil. It's a little teeny thin skin of soil around these rocky outcrops. So as soon as those trees disappear, we can rapidly get into a situation where the soil erodes and we can't plant a tree there even if we wanted to. Only 47 plant species remain. The last time I checked this, about 2 years ago. Half of the plants, vascular plants that we think were there at the time that the first Europeans landed are gone. Actually, the Polynesians landed are extinct. So we've lost at least half of the plants. What's left? 2 tree species, 2 shrub species, all less than the height of this room, right? So not these grandiose, tall canopies with really three-dimensional structure where birds and different critters can have different living areas and stuff. And what we're left with now is the situation where grasses, ferns, and sedges are the dominant plant morphology, growth morphology of the island. Also importantly, we think as this was going on, things appear to, it's very hard, right? So in this case, so John was talking about oral traditions or history, this and that. Yeah, it's confused. It's confused. What seems to have happened as things are beginning to change, we start to see huge social breakdown. There was implication that there's a lot of war going on, maybe cannibalism, although again, European interpretation, early European explorers, really, maybe, maybe not. But nevertheless, some kind of social upheaval was going on. And one of the best examples is the Birdman cult. This is not the Michael Keaton movie. This is old school. So, for example, what was described when the Europeans arrived was what's so-called Birdman cult. So the story was these. So who's in charge? The Birdman is in charge for 1 calendar year. Who determines who the Birdman is? At whatever day of the year, solstice or whatever, a bunch of the strongest dudes go down to the beach, and there's a little islet off of one of these coves where seabirds nest. And so they line everybody up and they say, ready, set, go. And the guys run in the water, jump in the water, swim across to the little islet, climb up the banks of the steep islet, supposed to grab a bird's egg, carry it with him back down, swim it back, and the first person to get back to the beach with an intact egg wins. And that person becomes the so-called Birdman. That dude becomes the leader for the year, right? Kind of like Survivor, right? Not maybe the most egalitarian, maybe not the most effective. So something. So this was the way that, in fact, sustainability was enforced on this island, right? So there's one person. If you didn't listen to him, I don't know, he'd bop you on the head or something horrible, right? So not very different from other ways of voting or tribal organizations. This was weird, right? This appears to be a desperate way to instill sustainability, a desperate way to ensure how scarce resources are allocated. So that's our first example. Everybody cool? That's the Easter Island example. So that shows that, yes, it is possible, by the way, idiots that comment about global warming and stuff, right? It is possible for us to get to the level or for us to behave in such a way that we degrade the environment to the level that it negatively harms us. So that's our first example. Second example. Epic of Gilgamesh. Anybody ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh in school? Only one? Only one? Oh, 2 classically trained students. Excellent. 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 Would either of you guys like to give us the quick summary, the quick 30-second version of the Epic of Gilgamesh? No.
If I remember correctly.
Oh, yeah, predicated that way, right. If I'm remembering correctly, right.
He goes out in the forest to basically prove his manliness, and he goes out and he kills a bunch of stuff, and then something, I think it's like
Okay, great. All right, also he dies miserably. Okay, so does that sound right, ladies? Is that, yeah, okay, right, here we go. So the Gilgamesh, this is one of our oldest epics that we know, oldest stories. We know it because we discovered it on a few tablets. One of those tablets up on the right, they're in the British Museum right now. If you guys go to the UK, you should go check them out. Pretty cool. So this is, at least in Western society, this appears to be our oldest written story. So this took place in Mesopotamia, so the Middle East, around 3,000-ish years BC, kind of time frame we're talking about. And while there's a whole story of Gilgamesh, I want to focus on the forest aspect of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so here's an excerpt from a 1972 translation. And so they're talking about cedar forests. I put a picture down here in Morocco from 2003, and a picture of Algeria, which you would never recognize now because it doesn't look like this anymore. But in 1934, so big. Think of like sierras, kind of big, tall, giant trees, broad, DBH, etc. Okay, so here we go. Cedar forest stretched, quote, for 10,000 leagues. What does that mean? I don't know. It's really far. 10,000 leagues in every direction. They stood still and gazed at the forest, at the mountains of cedars, the dwelling place of the gods. The hugeness of the cedars rose in front of the mountain. Its shade was beautiful. Full of comfort, mountain and glade were green with brushwood. So this is the Middle East, recall, right? This is a big forested area. And the story, we're talking about it because this is an example of what we would call now deforestation. So here's a modern photo of, again, Morocco in 2003. We see some scraggly little trees here on an escarpment. Here is from one of your former alumnus who was stationed in Iraq, but this is the greenest of the green time in this part of northern Iraq, right? So we have some grass here, and we have a little bit of scraggly trees here and there, but it's not this massive, closed canopy forest type situation. So here's the story. The story is Gilgamesh says, screw you to the gods. I want to do what I want. The gods say, hey, don't mess with the forest. And he says, screw you, I'm going to cut the forest down. So he basically cuts the forest down, and then because he didn't listen to them, the gods curse him. And not just him, but they curse the whole region of Sumeria with, depends on the translation, fire is often what is said. But that can also be translated as drought. So because you didn't listen to us, we caused a bunch of drought. That drought led to huge hardships. So we see the first ever, here's one of our dates you can put down, the first ever conservation law, in this case the first ever forest protection law we know of, was from the city of Ur, U-R, and that was 2700 BC. So this is the era of the Gilgamesh epic. Why would they be creating forest, don't chop the trees down laws if there was not a problem, right? So that signals something was amiss. By a couple hundred years later, by 2100 BC, agriculture is nuked by drought and over-saline soils and all of these problems. And so there's a lot of collapse of things that's going on. Now here's the most interesting thing to me. So the Gilgamesh translation, after 2000 BC, moves the story to Lebanon. So it moves it from Iraq to Lebanon. Why? Because so how do we make books back in the day? There was mostly monks and religious folks that were sequestered away, and they would copy texts, right? So they're copying it, and what's going on is some guys have been traveling, and they've gone to this area where we say that there are all these forests, and the guys say, these guys are super high, man. Not possible. There are no trees here. They must have screwed up. It's not possible for there to have ever been forests here in Iraq. Therefore, they must have been talking about Lebanon, which is more towards the coast and more wetter, and there are stuff. So it's beyond conception that those conditions could have ever existed, and it sounds too fake. So we need to move the location, because even for an epic poem, epic story, it's too far from reality. So evidence that our population can do something to mess with the local environment to the level that it harms our population. Second example. Third example, Aleutian Islands. Is that cool? Any questions about Gilgamesh? All good? Okay. Third example. So let's talk about the Aleutian Islands. So here we go. So here, so we have Eskimos and Inupiat are in the blue, and then the Aleut are in the red. So we're talking about the long tail of the archipelago of islands that trails off of Alaska. These folks were and are a hunter-gatherer population, society. These guys crossed the Bering Land Bridge, if you believe that, or if you've had any of our classes from our colleagues in the Anthro department. The Kelp Highway is now a popular alternative hypothesis, but whatever they boated across, or they walked across somewhere around 8,000, 10,000 years before present. Their population seems to have peaked on all these islands, something like 15,000 to 25,000 people, so a substantial population on these relatively far-flung islands. And these folks made a living by doing the things you would think they would do: hunting fish, hunting seals, birds, all that kind of stuff. They have had a rich culture, and they utilized everything, just about everything they could find that had some utility. So they utilized at least 80 and quite possibly a lot more than that species of plants, and for different purposes, for bedding, or for clothing, or for medicinal purposes, what have you. And because it's very cold, right? Their typical dwelling structures were partially dug into the ground, so they can get some thermal benefit and some insulation, basically. So these are the Aleutian Islands. Here is a former settlement on one of these islands, as seen from an airplane, about a decade ago. So if we just look at this, we kind of think, oh, whatever, there's nice pristine area, whatever. But if you're an archaeologist, you can look at this and you note what you think is a former village site. So there's no more people living here, or no more obvious structures. If you and I were to walk around the ground, we couldn't tell. But to the aided eye, each of these depressions to them looks like a house. And so again, here's one of those half buried house structures. And if we go there, again, if it looks like, for our unaided eye, it looks just like a meadow or an area, nothing special. But to the archaeologists, they start excavating, and sure enough, when they look in these areas, they actually find evidence of charcoal or oil fires or whatever the case may be. Interestingly, so people haven't lived there for a long time. Interestingly, the plants know they lived there. The plants know that people were there, sometimes hundreds or hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And so here are some plants that we see just above, on the ground, either right above or right next to these former house sites. And what we see is these are different genera of plants. If we're in a village site versus outside a village site, very different, very different. People have not lived here for hundreds of years. Let's look at the data. I'll orient you guys to this graph. So on the bottom axis, on the x-axis, this is time since people last lived there. Okay, it goes from 0 to thousands of years on the right. This is species richness of the plants living right now, or when they did this study about a decade ago, in the modern flora. And so the average is the circle, and there's standard errors going up either side. And so the dark circle, the white circle, the filled-in circle is the village, and the reference. What we see is there's a little bit of variance. Sometimes you can't quite tell, but most cases we could tell that there is this statistically significant difference. Even if, look over here to the right, even sometimes 3,500 years ago. So our legacy, our impact on the environment can last for a long time, right? This is not talking about crazy pollution and all this other stuff. This is just the basic stuff humans did before we made all the wonderful technology and things that we often think about when we talk about impact. Same story, in this case, looking at different islands, and it's the same thing. There's a significant difference between the village site is different. The village sites are different than reference sites. And not only do we impact plants, Here's the same data for birds. So if you go out right now and do bird counts, this is what you see. Again, village and reference sites differ. Probably the plants are, or excuse me, probably the birds are queuing off the plants, but for the level of our arguments, it doesn't matter, right? It is possible for humans to impact the environment to the point where it changes the usefulness of the environment or the ability of that environment to sustain us. Is that cool? Any questions? So we have the Easter Island example, we have the Mesopotamian forest example, or the Gilgamesh epic example, and the Aleutian Island example. Cool? Any questions about those? Everybody's just asleep, right? Okay, too much history. Okay, so there we go. Let's start that way. Next, let's talk about the conservation movement in the U.S. I think we'll do a little philosophy first, and then maybe we'll take a break and let you guys stretch. Okay, so before we talk about the conservation movement in the U.S., let's talk a little bit about the underpinnings of the conservation movement in the U.S. So this is a famous figure from Roderick Nash. Was anybody in Dr. Rodriguez's environmental history last year? So Professor Nash came. So he was one of my mentors when I was your guys' age. He was one of my. I had not seen him in about 15 years. I came to his lecture last year. So he was a professor at UCSB and is now retired. But this is from one of his famous books, and this is about the evolution of ethics. In this case, this is about the environment, but it applies to general conservation stuff and all that kind of jazz. So at the bottom of this is us. The bottom of this is us. So you can consider this as what happens with a baby, a child, or you can think about this in terms of the development of a society. Either one. It generally works either way. So the first, and so as he has articulated in this figure, it's our pre-ethical past, our ethical past, modern day, and then on into the future. And so in our context, the first thing you have to care about is yourself. You have to worry about yourself. You don't want to hurt yourself. You don't want to kill yourself. The next thing that you tend to care about, and what we're doing here is we're expanding the circle of concern, of worry, of ethical inclusion. So the first is us. The next thing comes our family, mom and dad, maybe our brothers, sisters. The next thing, our local immediate tribe, or maybe the people on our street or something like that. Then we go up to the region, so Southern California folks or Californians. Then we go up to nation, so then we're Americans, right? So yeah, right, that kind of deal. Next, and so this is where Nash argues that our modern society is somewhere in here. Depends on where we are on the planet and what society we're talking about, but this is the typical area we're in. Then we go to race, then we go to all humans, and then we start to include non-human things in our ethical concerns. The Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, that kind of stuff. So animals, and then because animals have warm fuzzy eyes and they have fur, and so they're easy to love, right? Plants are a little bit harder. Poison oak's a little harder to love, right? So then we go to plants. Next, all life. So E.O. Wilson, the Harvard biologist, has a famous book where he talks about biophilia, the love of life. And then things like rocks, inanimate objects, that rocks have some value, right? So in the national park, well, in I don't think it was a national park, I think it was a state park. But anyway, so some Boy Scouts a couple last year or so, year and a half ago, and they were in an area and they toppled a rock and they got in trouble. Because we have protections for even making sure we don't damage rocks, and then ecosystems and the planet and the universe. So we have this expanding circle of ethics, right? And conservation comes in here as we jump from humans to animals and plants in these areas, right? So let's talk about what some of our foundations are of this. So our foundations, we have a whole class just on this, right? Which, whole philosophy class, but we won't. Let's just summarize it in a couple slides. So in the context of us, for this class, in the context of conservation biology, we could maybe go back to, let's say, Darwin. We could actually go back to the Greeks and stuff as well, but we'll just go back to Darwin. And so here is from the descent of man. This is not The Origin of Species. This is one of his later books. But here's where Darwin says, as man advances in civilization and small tribes are united into larger communities, the simplest reason would tell each individual that he, because of course we're only talking to dudes, because right back in the day, so he ought to extend his social instincts and sympathies to all the members of the same nation, though personally unknown to him. This point being once reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent his sympathies extending beyond to the men of all nations and races. So Darwin is arguing that the Western ethical constructs are based on us being a member of a thing larger than us, being a member of a community. That's where our focus is, and that our selfish instincts, according to Darwin, prompt us to want to be selfish, and we use ethics to sort of act as a check on our initial instincts and make sure that we're caring about the community in one way, shape, or form. So Darwin is talking about there is a reason for ethics, and there's a reason to think about things other than us, even if at first glance it maybe appears that we should only serve our selfish short-term needs. Next is something probably all you guys have read in, has anybody taken Literature of the Environment yet? Okay, about half of you guys or so. So you guys read Aldo Leopold, and so Leopold formulates what's one of the most popular articulations of the basis for the conservation movement, which is the so-called land ethic. And so he articulates this in 1949. So this is what Leopold says. So he takes Darwin's ideas and adds in Charles Elton, who's a famous ecologist, old school ecologist, who invented niche theory. And so he says that ecology, quote, simply enlarges the boundaries of the community, meaning the community in which we would consider in our ethical web, in our ethical sphere, enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively what he calls the land. And so from this is derived the so-called golden rule of the land ethic, which is a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong when it tends to do otherwise. And there's been all kinds of other variants. We could go down and look at all kinds of things, but I think it's important to make sure that we have a truly representative articulation. So this is Aldo Leopold's land ethic. A similar thing comes from Rachel Carson. So she's articulated what people call the sea ethic. So it's not all dudes that make these statements. And so she traces her rationale back to Darwin's first book. So this is The Origin of the Species. And she talks about that, which Darwin is really worried about competition and really focuses on competition. And she says, yeah, but it could be other things as well. So she puts forward this framework and says that actually commonality is important. So collaboration, getting together is important. It's not just about competition and what's in me versus you. And so we can talk about this in terms of, in the context that she puts it into, we could talk about religion-based ethics, classical philosophy-based ethics, civil rights-based ethics, animal rights ethics, biocentric ethics, and then this larger inclusion thing where we're all together. So Carson sees the rationale is that for a land ethic or a sea ethic, as we might call it the way she articulated it, as everything is together. And we need everything. If everything isn't together, it'll be a problem, right? So if we aren't working together, the palm trees are going to go away and the island's going to get crazy and we're going to have a Birdman cult kind of argument. Cool? So we have a basis in Darwin you could trace this back to. You could trace it back to Aldo Leopold. You could trace it to Rachel Carson or any of several other authors. And I think, yeah. So here's a quote. Here's a quote from her. So I'll just read this quote and then we'll take a break. So this is from her very first book. So what's Rachel Carson famous for? Sound Spring. So what was her favorite book that she ever, when she talked about her favorite book? This one. Actually, this is the very first book she read. Read. Jeez. So she actually wrote a trilogy about the ocean. This is the first of the trilogy. And so she always told her friends this was her favorite, most favorite book. It's called Under the Sea Wind, 1941. And from it, she says, in one expert, possibly in our intuitive perceptions, we realize the indivisibility of the earth and respect it collectively, not as a useful servant, but as a living being, vastly less alive than ourselves in degree, but vastly greater than ourselves in time and space. A being that was old when the morning stars sang together, and when the last of us had been gathered into our fathers, we still be young. And so she goes on to say that this, therefore, quote, suggests one reason why we cannot destroy the earth with moral impunity. Namely, the earth is an organism possessing a certain kind and degree of life which we intuitively should respect as such. So there's all these different philosophical justifications for why we shouldn't chop down all the forests necessarily, why we shouldn't suck out all the fish. Okay, this is not a recent invention. This is not a liberal conspiracy or something of that nature. Okay, so again, taking us back to this evolution of ethics, and we'll take a break here. What we're talking about with conservation, and in conservation biology, we're in the present, and we're really at this interface between expanding our circle of ethics from beyond humans to non-human living systems, and indeed, quite possibly also to non-living systems. So the energy flows and material flows and all that kind of good stuff. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break. You guys go stretch, and I'll see you guys back in 10 minutes.